Welcome to Seafarers and International House for this afternoon session with Rose George. On behalf of NAMA, the North American Maritime Ministry Association, I'd like to welcome you. My name is Jason Zeidema, I'm the Executive Director. I'm not alone here from NAMA. In fact, there is a number of NAMA members who are here from all over the country. Rose has written this wonderful book, which here in North America is 90% of everything in perhaps the rest of the world. It's known as Deep Sea and Foreign Going, or at least in the UK it has a different name, but it still is the same book, and it's a wonderful book. Before I invite Rose, I'd like to invite Reverend Marsh Draghi to come on behalf of Seafarers and International House and welcome you.
Thanks, Jason. My name's Pastor Marsh Draghi, and I'm the Director of Seafarers and International House, and I welcome you to this event, or as we call it liturgically, pre-St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you very much to Seafarers International House for hosting this. Thank you to NAMA, to Iswan, everybody. It's great to be here. The last time I was in New York City, I was here doing some research for the book, which actually never made it into the book, sadly, but I went out on the McAllister tugs. Very famous New York tug family. Tugs are operated by families. It's kind of like taxi cabs. And we went out into the harbour and we saw all of New York from the wheelhouse of a tug. So that was wonderful, memorable, but not enough to get into my book. Sorry, McAllister. So I'm going to take you through sort of the backstory of the book and how I came to write about shipping, because it certainly wasn't an obvious career choice for me. Marshall has kind of stolen my born inland kind of thunder, but I also, although I come from a much smaller part of the world, I also grew up as far as it was possible to be from the sea in England, which I think is 72 miles or 73 miles. I grew up in inland West Yorkshire in the north of England. We had no seafarers in our family. My grandfather was a miner, my father was a vicar. There was no sea, no shipping. The only maritime experience I had was taking the ferry to France. This was in pre-tunnel days. My mother assures me that we used to go on holiday to the seaside quite often, but I must have blanked that out of my memory because I don't remember that. But I don't think of myself at all, although I come from the UK, which is a maritime nation with a long maritime history. I never thought of myself as maritime. I don't like to swim in the ocean. I'm scared of when I can't see the bottom. I can't sail. I don't even eat fish. I mean, there's just no hope for me. But somehow I ended up writing a book about shipping, and somehow in 2010 I ended up running away to sea. So why did I do that? I am an author, but also a journalist, and before I wrote a book about shipping, I wrote a book about sanitation, and you can make the connection probably through. And I spent 4 or 5 years writing about sanitation, visiting a lot of latrines, and then it came to choosing another book topic, and I wanted to find something that I found as fascinating as sanitation that would really engage me, because writing a book is a long process. It can take 3 or 4 years. You really have to love your subject. And I thought back to when I first went freelance in 1999. I was working at a magazine called Colours Magazine, which is a Benetton magazine, and it was a great job. We had an office with a view of the Dolomites in northern Italy. I mean, there are worse offices to work in, but it was a desk job. And when I left, I thought, I just want to move. I want to move. And my friend Simon Winchester, who you may have heard of, as he's a lot more famous than me, he said, well, why don't you go on a container ship? I said, okay. So my first freelance assignment was in 1999 on an orange ship, a Canadian ship, Canmar ship, I don't think Canmar exists anymore. And we crossed the Atlantic in midwinter. Me and 22 Indians, absolutely lovely crew, which had the net effect of me not touching curry for 3 years. It wasn't bad curry, but when you have it for breakfast, lunch and dinner for 10 days, it just has a certain effect. But when I disembarked in Montreal, actually, we went down the St. Lawrence and broke the ice all the way down, and although the weather in the middle of the Atlantic was memorable, by the time we got to Montreal, I just thought that is one of the most extraordinary experiences I have ever had. And I have travelled to some very strange places. I have been to Saddam Hussein's birthday party twice. And yes, there was a cake. It was a lot bigger than that one, and it was shaped like a flower. I have been to Bhutan. I have watched a football match played in Bhutan. I have been to Kosovo. I've been down Suez. I mean, I've been to weird places. But when I thought, okay, what am I going to write about next? I thought that is one of the most compelling and compellingly foreign environments I have ever encountered, was that ship. So I started to look into the possibility of writing about shipping. And this was about 2009, 2010. And around about that time, Harvard Business School, which has a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing it does every year, which is it nominates its best business model. And around that time, it nominated Somali Piracy as its best business model. And of course, this got a lot of media attention. There's no one from Disney in the room, is there? Because I haven't actually asked permission for this picture, so let's just move on quickly. But it was presented as kind of funny, you know, oh, Harvard Business School thinks Somali piracy is a really good business model. So I saw that and I thought that's a bit weird, and I looked into it, and I found that same year, sort of early 2010, there were 544 seafarers held hostage on their ships. And I thought, what an extraordinary thing. Number one, that is an awful lot of seafarers being held hostage. Number two, why don't we know about it? And I made a comparison with a case which you may remember, which was the Chilean miners. You remember a load of miners were trapped in the mine in Chile? And there were about fewer than 100, I think, were trapped in the mine. It was more than a month, I think, they were trapped. And there were 1,000 journalists reporting on every single event regarding their situation. And okay, in Somalia, it's difficult to get to Somalia, but the ships were all anchored off Somalia in plain sight. You could get to them. And yet there was just no record of these seafarers. Their voices were not heard at all. And I started to get very curious. And I began to look a bit more into shipping. And I discovered an extraordinary fact, which is just how dependent we are on shipping. And I think it's fair to say that in the general public, there's possibly a perception of ships and shipping as somewhat old-fashioned, kind of retro, and you know, old salty sea dogs, and you know, Marlon Brando at the docks and things like that. And there was a video done by the British Maritime Foundation, which just interviewed people on the streets of Southampton, which is a very major port city in the UK, very big maritime history. And they said, well, how much stuff comes by ship? And they said, 30%, 40%, dunno. And of course, the answer is 90% of world trade still travels by ship. So although we think of shipping maybe as an old-fashioned industry, it's in fact, we are more dependent on it than ever before. And it is an extremely cutting-edge modern industry in some ways. So I found this figure, 90% of everything, and I thought, okay, well, who's running this? And I looked into container shipping, which I found very, very interesting. And I found this company, Maersk, which I had probably seen Maersk containers growing up. But I hadn't paid them any attention. And I just happened to do a comparison between the revenues of Maersk and the revenues of Microsoft. And they're pretty much the same. And I thought, well, why have we never heard of Maersk? And how can we know about Microsoft? Why do we know the people who bring us the software, but we don't know the people who bring us the computers that use that software? The revenues of Maersk in 2011, I think it was 60.2 billion. Huge company, huge. And of course, it is a business-to-business industry. There's no particular reason you should encounter Maersk, but still, it's astonishing how invisible they were in modern life. So I thought, this is odd. And I realized that what I was thinking about, what I was finding out about shipping already had a name, thanks to the first Sea Lord, who is the head of the Admiralty in the UK. Although as I say in the book, it's a shame that the head of the army is not called a landlord. But the first Sea Lord said what we have in the UK now, he was particularly talking about Royal Navy cuts, but he was saying what we have is general sea blindness. We do not see the sea anymore. And even though we depend on it more than ever, because we now travel by plane, the sea to us is really a patch of blue that we fly over. It's something on an in-flight map. It's not a place of industry. It's a place where you may go for fish and chips or your holidays, or you may go sailing. It's a place of leisure, but it's not seen as a place of work. And because we don't see it as a place of work, we don't see the people who work on it anymore. So I thought the best way to counter all this and to feed my curiosity at that point was to obviously run away to sea. And people have asked me, well, they asked me also this question also about how I got down the sewers and how I got on a ship, and the answer is the same in both cases, is I asked and I kept on asking. So I approached Maersk because they were the biggest container shipping line, I think they still are. And I said, please can I go on one of your ships? And they said, maybe. They're Danish, they're like that, they're very cautious. And fair enough, because the shipping industry is not known for its, how can I put this politely? It's not known for its openness. It's been left to its own devices for a long time. And probably 60, 70 years since the Second World War, that was probably the last time anyone really paid attention to shipping, because we had the Battle of the Atlantic. And it's become a sort of inward-looking industry. And so it's not very usual. It's quite a risk for a shipping company to let a journalist on board. But they did eventually, and to their credit, they gave me no rules or regulations. I could talk to who I wanted, I could write what I wanted. So I ended up at Felixstowe on a Friday in June. Anybody who's been to sea knows that that's the worst day you can possibly go to sea. It's the most unluckiest. It's the unluckiest. Because it's the day of the crucifixion and sailors are a superstitious lot, and you can't go to sea on a Friday. You shouldn't have a woman on ship. It wasn't boding well, really. But so there I am at the gangway at Felixstowe, and if you've I know there are a lot of port chaplains here and ship visitors in this room, and but you'll know that perhaps if you think back to your first time in a modern port, how absolutely overwhelming it is. Because it's just everything's so huge and everything is so mechanized and mechanic and sort of inhuman. You don't really see people walking around the port anymore. It's too dangerous. A container port I'm talking about. Most people are in vehicles or in gantry, in cranes or in cabs. Or it's a very sparsely populated place if you just stand there and look around. So I'm standing at the bottom of the gangway. Two of the crew come down to fetch me, to take me up. What I learn are pretty typical seafarers because they're Asian and they're exhausted. And they take me up to the ship. One of them, another guy comes along who's called Igor, and he says, okay, here's your cabin, here are your quarters, and then they lead me to it. So I'm on the ship, we're just watching all the containers being loaded, and it's probably the most foreign place I've ever been, and I don't really know what to do. So I rattle around a bit. Then I go for a walk around the ship, and I'm struck by how empty it is. There doesn't seem to be anyone around. Now, of course, in ports, very, very busy times. Crew have a lot to do. They have to watch what's going on with the loading and the unloading. There's lots of paperwork to fill in, but even so, that evening when I got to, I was told to turn up for dinner at 6 o'clock sharp, and I did, and that was my, this is Marius, the second officer, looking, that's a pretty normal state for him. He was also pretty exhausted all the time. But I entered, so here's the dining room, the officer's saloon on Kendal, and that was my first shock. Was that when I sat down, that there were only 19 crew on board. And this is a ship that was 3 football fields long, that's soccer fields, I think, American football pitches, 300 meters long. To me, absolutely huge. It Kendal carried nearly 7,000 containers, so to me it was an enormous ship, but it's just a mid-sized ship and is getting smaller and smaller as Maersk does bigger and bigger ships. But to me it was an enormous vessel, and yet there were only 19 people on it. And so we sat down at dinner, and they put me, I can't imagine why they put me under the Queen. That was my seat. They put me there, and so next to me I had, so I was sitting opposite a Romanian, I was sitting next to a Burmese, I had an Indian, Moldavian, not a Moldovan. He made that very clear, you should not confuse the two. First of all, I had a Polish captain, he paid off, and then I had a British captain, British chief engineer, on the back table, Chinese, 2 British cadets, and in the other room, all Filipino ratings, all Filipino crew. So, a typical ship. And that's something that people who know nothing about shipping find very surprising, that they may think that they're harking back to the 19th century when they think that shipping was a very homogenous industry. It never was, really. There was always chopping and changing of crews and flags and everything. But I was pretty surprised. I had no idea that it would be such a multinational ship and that it would be considered to be so normal. The common language was English, at least I think it was. Some of them didn't speak, but the common language was English. And in fact, I was extremely lucky in the crew that I was put to sea with, because the British captain, Glenn, was basically perfect for someone who's writing a book, because he'd been at sea for 42 years. So he'd been at sea he had almost exactly paralleled the rise of containerization and the dramatic change in the shipping industry. And he saw me as an advantage on his ship. He saw me as someone different to talk to. I mean, when you're stuck with 19 people all the time, then anyone different is seen as a bonus. And he was just an absolute pleasure to be with, and I learned a lot from him. I still don't know how to operate a sextant, but I'm trying. So there I am, a supernumerary on board this ship, and but I was welcomed. It could have gone either way, because that was when people say to me, and a lot of reviews of my book and interviews have said, "Wow, isn't she brave to go to sea?" To which I say, but 1.2 million people do it every single day, and they don't get called brave or even get any attention or any kind of credit. So I don't really understand why it's considered brave. But to be fair, when I first got on board, I didn't know who I was going to be at sea with, and that's the situation of every seafarer who goes to sea. Barely any seafarer now is attached to a ship. Every seafarer will have a contract. Particularly the Filipinos, they'll all be employed by manning agencies in the Philippines or Cyprus or wherever, and they will be sent wherever. They could be on a coal-carrying ship one minute and a container ship going a completely different route the next. That's just the reality of modern shipping and how the labour market works in shipping now. But what it can lead to is the fact that you can go aboard a ship and you have no idea who you're going to be with. And if you happen to have a situation where you don't get on with your crew, it can be very, very difficult. Now, I was lucky that my crew were great and they were welcoming, but it can go wrong. And I do confess that I was a woman going to sea. I didn't know if there'd be any women on board. There was actually Pinky, the Filipino cook. So she was a woman, and that was quite a relief, but I did not wear skirts for 2 weeks. And eventually, when I got on board, I locked my cabin door every time I went out, and then eventually didn't lock it, then eventually left it open, then eventually left it wide open like everybody else. So eventually I got much more settled. And I was on board for 5 weeks, 39 days. We were travelling from Felixstowe to Singapore, and we were going through the Indian Ocean, which at the time, because this was 2010 when those 544 seafarers were being held hostage, was the kind of golden age of piracy, Somali piracy. And I was actually the last supernumerary who was allowed on a Maersk ship before there was a guy who also went to sea on a Maersk container ship the following year, and he had to disembark and get on again in Malaysia. He wasn't allowed through the Indian Ocean, but I was, and I thought I was being really intrepid and courageous until we got to the bottom of the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Aden, and then I just thought I was really stupid because I was terrified. I was really nervous, and the captain regularly said to me, "Why do you want to come through here voluntarily? Are you mad?" And these guys, although Kendal was not considered to be a risk, not considered to be at risk from piracy because it had a 10-metre high freeboard. So the height of the ship was considered too high for pirates to easily scale. To which I said, pirates evolve, and they're not stupid. But they weren't, the captain had requested barbed wire and he wasn't allowed it. It wasn't considered within the budget, which didn't please him very much. There were no armed guards on the ship at this point. Armed guards were not common on ships in 2010. So it was a question of luck and his skill if we were attacked. We knew that if we were attacked, that pirates could scale the ship in less than 15 minutes. And if you've seen Captain Phillips, which I recommend because I think it's a pretty accurate representation of a pirate attack, you'll see how quickly that happened. And unless you've got a naval warship sitting right there within 15 minutes, and unless you've got a safe citadel, and citadels weren't that common in 2010, then you're a hostage. And those of you who followed Somali piracy and understood know that some ships were held for more than 3 years. And there are still 60 or 70 hostages being held on ships as we speak. And one of them, a Thai fishing crew, has been held for 2.5 years, I think. So when the ship reached the bottom of the Gulf of Aden, and I suddenly realised quite how stupid and foolish I'd been, the ship changed. And suddenly everything was, all the portholes were covered, all the windows were covered, so that it would just slightly disorient pirates when they came aboard, so they'd have to figure out, they'd find it slightly more difficult to know the important parts of the ship. We had blackouts. It was like the Blitz. Total blackouts every night. One of the junior officers, his job was to come around and just snap everything into place. And in general, there was a real air of tension and nervousness on the ship. Now, seafarers are a tough lot, and they would never, ever confess to a woman that they were feeling nervous. But they were nervous. You could tell that the atmosphere really changed. And consider that they were going through a week. There was a week of that. We had a week of pirate watch while we travelled through the Indian Ocean. And they had that every 2 months or so. And they were doing that with no kind of counselling, no kind of backup. They were just going through that level of stress as part of their daily job. And they didn't have any particular bonuses or anything at that point. That was just their job. They just had to do it. If they didn't do it, they could get blacklisted. It's denied that there's any blacklisting in certain manning agencies, but it does exist. And so they just had to put up with it, and they had to just keep going through the Indian Ocean. And we were lucky, we weren't attacked. There were 2 suspicious approaches at night, and there was a tanker, the Golden Blessing, which was taken hostage on exactly our route the day before. So that was a bit alarming, but we got through the Indian Ocean safely. And we got to Salalah, which is the kind of port of refuge where you go and let your hair down, even though it's in a supposedly dry country, but there's a little bit of leeway, luckily. Not that we're allowed to drink, that's the other thing. Maersk seafarers are not allowed to drink. It's a dry ship. All Maersk ships are dry now, and there's reasons behind that, but I think they're grown-ups and they could be allowed a beer. So it has impacted on shipboard life, because that's the other thing about shipboard life is if any of you have gone to sea on a container ship, I think one of the things that will strike you is quite how lonely and boring it is. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is just the kind of modern curse of screen obsession that works on a ship. So instead of hanging around at dinner time, instead of having group situations where people will just hang out and have a film, then people will just after dinner. I mean, I timed how long it took people to eat dinner, and it was 6 minutes. So that's not socializing, that's fueling. And they would have their dinner, and they would go back to their cabins, and they would watch DVDs in private. There was very little socialization. Occasionally you'd hear one of the Filipinos doing some karaoke in their mess room, but very interesting. Have you ever heard Journey being sung in Tagalog? It's quite interesting. But it was pretty lonely. We started, me and the second officer, Marius, we started a backgammon competition. One of the Mike, the Romanian chief engineer, told me that they'd once done a passage, I can't remember, I think it was 5 weeks of sea time, and they'd once done a passage and they'd got up to like 1,000 matches or something. So it wasn't that bad, but he still beat me. But it's pretty lonely, and the captain, I would interview the captain every day, and he was nostalgic, but he was very aware of the kind of nostalgia he was talking about. And I think his nostalgia was legitimate, because he would look back to a time where he had time to go ashore. And somebody said to me, you know, we used to have time to go ashore for a week because ships were in port for a week, and now we don't even know if we have time to go for a newspaper. And I think some research recently has found that most seafarers have, I think, an average of 2.5 hours in port. That's on container ships. So seafarers' missions, as you all know in this room, are absolutely vital, because seafarers just can't get any further. They don't have time. It's very expensive. They sometimes get exploited by taxi firms. So it's absolutely vital that they have somewhere to go on the ship. The other surprising thing on Kendal is that it didn't have any internet. It had dial-up email, but there was not much privacy. There was allegedly you had a private box that went through the captain, but there's no Skyping, there's no browsing, there's no gaming. I think there is now on Maersk. I think they have rolled it out over the fleet, but you know, so we are trying to attract, or the industry is trying to attract young people to go to sea, and it is an amazing thing to do, to be at sea, to be in the middle of the ocean, on the wildest place on the planet. It is a wonderful thing, but on the other hand, we're asking them to put up with a career where they get very little time ashore, very stressed. If they're from certain countries like Pakistan or Malaysia or Indonesia, if they come to the US, they probably won't be allowed ashore at all, simply because of where they're from. And we're asking them to put up with conditions that the average 5-year-old would not tolerate, as in not having an iPad that works. So there are retention issues. These are big questions, and I think the industry is beginning to address them, and they do know that they need to attract people into the career. But in the UK, for example, our seafaring populace is going down all the time. It's just gone down again, I think, quite significantly. So it's a problem. This is a bit where I get some flack, particularly from people like Michael Gray. He doesn't like it when I go all eco. But I was interested in the environmental impact of shipping, and when I was on board I used to look up at the funnel and see this really black smoke belting out and think, that doesn't look healthy. And of course it's not, and I didn't know, and I looked into it, that Kendal, like any other ship on the high seas, burns something called bunker fuel, which was described to me as one step up from asphalt and crud. That was a quote from, I think, someone, it may have been in Tanko, I may be misquoting that, but it was someone in the industry who called it crud. And it's really, it's not very nice stuff. It's full of particulates that you don't want to be breathing in. It's full of, it's got environmental impact in terms of emissions. So this statistic is actually a little bit out of date, because Maersk keeps building large ships, and this was from 2012, and at that point it was calculated that the 15 largest ships were emitting as much as all the cars in the world, about 780 million cars, I think. And if you do look at, of course, shipping is the most benign method of mass transport. There's no doubt about that. It is much more environmentally friendly than aviation or trucking, by far. The trouble is that because there's so much of it, it does have an environmental impact, which is huge. And if you if you do a list of nations in terms of how much they emit, it comes in about number 6, just above Germany. And people argue about the percentages of the emissions that shipping produces, but it's generally thought to be between 3.5–4%, which is on a par with aviation. Now, of course, there are many more ships than there are planes, but still, it's something that needs to be addressed, and it is being addressed. You do find a lot of shipping conferences now addressing sustainability and talking about green shipping, and I think, but even so, there are new regulations coming in which are going to be addressing the fuel issue and trying to impose more environmentally friendly fuel, but at the same time, there aren't that many ships who've bought the scrubbers, as they're called, that you're needed to run that fuel. So it's slow going. I also, in my book, I didn't just stay on Kendall. I did go off to, this is another bit which Michael Gray didn't like. If you know Michael Gray from Lloyd's List, he's pretty forthright. And this is a bit where he called me kind of a woolly hippie or something. So I wanted to go and look at another impact of shipping, which is acoustic emissions and underwater noise. And something I didn't know about the ocean or hadn't really computed it was that, of course, light doesn't penetrate more than 200 meters down, so ocean creatures communicate by sound. And unfortunately, a lot of shipping propellers the noise that they make is at the same frequency as many whales use for communication. So I went to Cape Cod to look at what's being done for the North Atlantic right whale, which is one of the most endangered species in the world, because it's called the urban whale because it lives very close to the eastern seaboard, but it also lives very closely to a lot of shipping lanes. So it can be, they often do get hit by shipping propellers, but they also suffer quite a lot from the noise issue. So some whales have now, the humpback whale they've found, some of their acoustic habitat has been reduced by 90%. That's not just by shipping by any means, but shipping is a big contributor. So it's also sonar, it's also man-made activity in the seismic surveys. But we are wrecking the ocean underwater pretty much as we're wrecking the land. This is where I come to the point where I realise that I've probably been quite negative about shipping, and I try and bring it back because somebody who reviewed my book called it a love story with a ship. So I think that's true. I really, really loved being on board. When I had to disembark in Singapore, I was very, very grumpy, and I wanted to go straight back on. I would happily have got back on for another 5 weeks. Because there is nowhere else like it. It's the most extraordinarily foreign environment. I don't just mean in who you're having dinner with for those 6 minutes, but I mean there is nowhere as wild as the ocean, and that's its advantage, but it's also a disadvantage because it means that although on paper the ocean is tightly regulated with the International Convention on the Law of the Sea and all sorts of things, in fact these things can be escaped because of a system called flags of convenience. So the modern shipping industry is now 60 to 70% of ships are now fly what's known as an open registry or a flag of convenience. So they can fly any foreign flag they choose. They can just rent a flag. It's pretty much like a brand. Certain registries have more onerous conditions than others. And luckily most ship owners and operators are scrupulous, but the ones who aren't can very easily flee investigation and prosecution because a lot of these registries offer anonymity, corporate anonymity, as a condition, as part of the package. So they're called flags of convenience because they're very convenient. So you don't have to, you have lower taxes, you can employ whoever you like. What that means is if someone is wanting to behave in a negative, an exploitative way, then it's pretty easy to do so, which is why even today you can look up, for example, in the UK last year we had ships abandoned on the Tyne, we had seafarers waiting 6-9 months to be paid. The ITF is still having to claw back $30 million a year in wages that are unpaid to seafarers. There is still too much delinquency in shipping, and there are people in shipping who are trying to combat that, and I do appreciate that, but I do salute every single chaplain and ship visitor and anyone who is working in seafarers' welfare, because it is really needed. Now, I can't remember who it was, Jason who mentioned that, Roger mentioned that I'm running the London Marathon. I am running that for Seafarers UK. And people do ask me, well, why on earth why should they be a charity case? Why are you running for seafarers? They get a salary, what's your problem? And I say because they don't always get their salary. They don't always get paid. They work in extremely dangerous conditions. It's a hazardous job. It's the second most dangerous job in the world after fishing. And sometimes they are far too easily exploited, and they need people to fight for them because they're out at sea without internet sometimes, without 999, 911, without a police force without union representation on the high seas. They need support. And if we are going to delight in our cheap clothing and our coffee and our bananas and everything that's in this room pretty much, I can probably guarantee what probably didn't come by ship. Maybe the water, maybe the cake. Some of the ingredients probably came by ship though. So if we want to carry on with our globalized, cheap consumer lifestyle, then I think we need to start supporting more the people who are enabling that. And if someone comes up to you and says, well, why should I give a monkeys about seafarers? Well, you don't want them to go on strike because you're not going to get anything in the shops. And there was a strike in the Port of Long Beach, I think last year or the year before, and it lost millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I salute all of you who work in seafarers' welfare, and I want to salute my crew because I don't know where they are now. Kendall has been reflagged to the USA, interestingly. So it's actually one of I think there's about 100 ocean-going ships in the US now, flying the US flag. So I think there's about 106 now because they've just flagged them to the US. It's now called Maersk Denver. I don't know where my crew is. I know where my captain is because he's retired. So he sends me regular emails about mistakes he's found in the book. But I just thought there aren't that many. He's a pedant. No, he's fine. He's precise. But I'll finish by reading you just a couple of things. I've lost one of them, so I'll just read you one. So Captain Glenn, my hero, he wrote an autobiography and he shared it with me. There were no mistakes in this. I did quote it properly. I checked with him. So he concludes the autobiography by writing to an imaginary cadet, wondering if he will have as good an experience as he did. And he did have a good experience. He says he has loved being at sea. He just didn't love what the job has become. So he thinks the cadet will have as good an experience because he will be in awe at the sight of his first vessel looming so much larger before him than it was for me. He, a deck cadet, will be mesmerized by the technology on the bridge, more reminiscent of a jet aircraft cockpit. He, an engineer cadet, will be shocked at the jaw-dropping huge main engine, probably larger than his house. He may find that every day could be an adventure. He may not have so much time in port, but he will see the world and he will get past the dockside areas of my day. He will face the same high seas as I, and may even feel the romance of the oceans. This is from a man who said the sea was just cold and wet. He will behold seaborne wildlife such as dolphins, whales, and lost souls of the albatross all in their natural state. He's getting a bit romantic here. He will meet peoples of so many different cultures and creeds to become truly international in outlook. He will meet captains who will have time for him, not like in my day as they rarely spoke to lowly cadets. But then he wrote me another email. And he wrote, "You can see how we are really thought of." This was in some other scandal. This is a captain who regularly over dinner voiced his objections about the fact that Maersk had decided that to save a couple of $20,000 or so a year, that its crew were not allowed to use paper napkins anymore, and they had to use kitchen roll. And it seems like a small thing, but to him, to someone who's at sea for 5 weeks at a time, 2 months at a time, to him that was a mark of contempt, really. And to me, that the kitchen roll, serviettes, napkin gate, it really symbolized to me a difficulty between shore and sea, and a real disconnect with how many people in shipping have never been to sea for any length of time, and they don't really understand what it's like to be in a pretty stressful, intimate environment. I mean, you're surrounded by wildness, but you're in a very intimate environment, and things can become very, very important. Anyway, to end on a Captain Glenn note. So you can see how we are really thought of, riff-raff that no one really cares about, no matter the lip service paid to our safety and welfare by the likes of owners, flag state, IMO. We are mere chattels, a human resource, dispensable non-entities. We are the frontline troops who dance forward into the breach at point-blank range to whatever tune is played, whining over, I am right though. That's it from me. If you have any questions, I'll happily try and answer them. Thank you.